event. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending the Centre for Welsh Studies' latest webinar. The title of this evening's event is The Welsh Economy in Need of Radical Change. I know it's a topic all of our panelists are very keen to discuss, and it's an issue that I think is going to be quite prominent with the upcoming Senate elections in a few weeks' time. So I'll start introducing you to our panelists, and we'll move on then to hear all what they have to say about the Welsh economy. Firstly, we have Dr. Juan Anzola, who is a research associate at the Centre for Welsh Studies. He's recently written a fantastic, really interesting report about the Welsh economy. So if you're keen to have a look, you can check it out on our website. We have Professor Kent Matthews from Cardiff University. Both Juan and Kent have spoken at our events previously, and they made a really big impact. I know that a lot of people messaged me afterwards saying how interesting their ideas were. So it's great to have you both back. Thank you very much. And we have two new people attending our event this evening. Jim Jones, CEO of North Wales Tourism Limited. So it's great to have someone from North Wales to give a sort of overview of what's happening there and how that economy can improve. And last but not least, we have Andrew Davies, the leader of the Welsh Conservatives in the Senedd. So I'll start with you, Juan. I know you're a young, passionate guy. You've got a lot to say about the Welsh economy. Yeah. Do you think the Welsh economy is in need of radical change?
Yes, I do. Actually, as I kept thinking about this issue, I kept going back to young people in Wales. I kept going back to a personal anecdote, something that happened to me recently. I took a cab here in Swansea, where I'm based, and I was having a discussion with the cab driver. And he told me that, once his children turned 18, they left Wales, and he could totally understand it. And that was kind of heartbreaking to hear, because he said, I really don't think what younger people would do here in Wales. There's nothing for them. And he was even surprised that I came to Wales at all. So he asked me, do you work for DVLA? Do you work for the council? Do you work for the public sector? And I said, no. So he still couldn't understand what I was doing in Wales. And that was really heartbreaking to hear, because I think that's the story for a lot of people here in Wales. And I kept thinking, what is it that is making younger people leave Wales? Why is there such a brain drain? Why hasn't the government addressed that problem effectively? Why doesn't it seem bothered by that? And one of the conclusions that I came up with is that I think we have a government here in Wales that is far more concerned about its budget than about building a future economy for future generations. It's a government that is more worried about taxes, about sustaining that budget, than actually providing the incentives and I think the opportunities for young people to build their lives as they wanted it to be. Because I think there's something quite condescending when a government just says, I'm going to provide everything I think you need for you, instead of giving people the means for them to actually create it for themselves. Because who knows better what we need than ourselves? And I think that's something that I kept going back to. And also, where's the ambition to actually create projects like tech hubs, startups, to provide those incentives here in Wales that I think we desperately need to make Wales an attractive place for younger people to not only come, but to Welsh young people to actually stay. Where's also attractive things that I kept thinking about, for instance, branding. Why haven't we done a better job at creating some sort of brand that makes it more interesting for younger people to invest and stay here in Wales? I think other parts in the world and even within the UK have been far more successful in selling their countries than Wales has been. Also, like recently when we heard about free ports in the UK introduced by the Chancellor, I kept wondering, why didn't Wales push for this kind of stuff before the Chancellor? Do we have to wait for the UK government to come up with the interesting ideas for us to implement anything? And instead of thinking, for instance, which I'm sure we'll hear about this later, instead of thinking of ways to punish tourism in Wales through taxes that the government says that it's going to push, a tourism tax, I keep wondering, why not create the incentives for people to actually come to Wales, to see what Wales is about, to invite people. I think the Welsh tourism industry desperately needs tourism. It constantly battles against England and Scotland in terms of tourism. So we need that. Why would you punish that? And one of the things that I think at the core of all of this, I kept going back to the housing issue, which is a thing that I think is at the center of the economic problem here in Wales, in the UK, but here in Wales for younger people, and is the opportunity for home ownership. And I think that's something that the government has failed to address properly. The land transaction tax, I think most economists agree that shouldn't exist, that it penalizes sellers and buyers, that it creates a lot of economic issues all across the board. And not only that, the help to buy scheme is another thing that I'm always very suspicious of, because at the end of the day, you're telling younger people that to afford a home, not only do they need to meet a threshold, so right now it's 300,000, but it will be lowered again to 250,000. So it's telling them this is as much as you are able to get. This is how the cap of your aspiration, only a home at 250,000. But also you're going to be engaged in two loans. You don't only get one loan, but two loans. The loan for the deposit and then the bigger loan that you have to pay afterwards. So what kind of start is that for younger people? So I think my generation and younger ones have little to no prospects to own property here in Wales. And it's certainly putting life on hold for a lot of us. And, you know, a lot of people wait to actually own a home, to start their projects as a family, to start their life indeed. So I think that's a big problem. And what kind of promising economy can Wales, or what kind of economy can Wales promise to future generations if it really hasn't done the proper things to guarantee that in the first place? So I would argue that a lot of things have to change for younger people, and that should be an important focus for the government and any future government.
Thanks, Swans. Really interesting points. I mean, for example, when you drive to Scotland, you see, as soon as you get up to the border, welcome to Scotland, huge branding. They've nailed their branding for the international tourism market. And when you compare that to Wales, you know, we don't even compare. We're not on the same level. So Scotland, there's so many lessons we can learn from people like up in Scotland. Jim, what do you think?
Well, not like that. Good evening, everybody. Interesting you say that, Matthew, because we've got a different view in terms of how we sell, especially North Wales. I think the first thing to say is, you know, North Wales is different to Mid Wales, and it's definitely different to South Wales. And at this moment in time, before the pandemic struck, you know, we were promoting ourselves as the adventure capital of Europe. And North Wales, you know, we have some, you know, world-class businesses. And you think of Airbus, Toyota, JCB, Siemens, Moneypenny, and then you look at some of our world first tourist attractions, which have been hugely invested in. I talk about the Zip World, the Adventure Park, Snowdonia, Rib Ride. These are all first class, first of its kind attractions in the whole of the world. So for example, the fastest zip wire in the world, the longest zip wire, the biggest underground trampoline, the first wave garden in the world where you can go surfing in Snowdonia, and the fastest rib ride in the world, to name but a few. So our tourism economy in North Wales, which is worth about 3.6 billion and employs about 46,000 full-time equivalent jobs, you know, is really, really important to our economy. And I think I've been slightly disappointed during this pandemic because of the anti-visitor, anti-tourism rhetoric. Now, we've tried to deal with that by obviously speaking to our members, encouraging them to, you know, promote as much as they possibly can about the warm welcome that they will receive in Wales. And North Wales Tourism, you know, we have 1,500 paid up members. We get no subsidy from the government and been operating for 30 years. And we speak to our businesses all the time. constantly, either by emails, phone calls. And this pandemic has highlighted a lot of weaknesses. And the biggest weakness for me is the fact that the Welsh Government aren't listening to the businesses. And the reason I say that is because we've been asking for some time, over the last 12 months, we've been writing letters, we've been making phone calls, speaking to the responsible officers and to the Senate members about issues that are affecting our businesses. And yet, time and time again, nothing happens. I'll give you two examples. One, there's still a number of businesses that exist in North Wales and probably throughout the whole of Wales. And bear in mind, most of our sector are built up of micro businesses as well. Most of them still haven't received the support that they should have received. Most of them operate under 10 employees, so they haven't been eligible to apply for any of this funding that have been given out by Welsh Government. And yet we've been lobbying on behalf of them to say, look, you need to be focused on providing that support, because it's been absolutely devastating for them. And they're still to this day in limbo. And this is number two, we've been asking for some timelines, some dates. We're all grown up. We're very, very professional in terms of our outlook. Our businesses are. They need time to plan, prepare, and they need to know what's going on. And we've been asking for that since day one. Everyone you speak to in business has said, look, we just need a little bit of certainty, some idea of some dates so we can start planning. This has not been forthcoming. And I know the Welsh Government have justified the reason why they don't give that information, but that's what we've been asking for. And this has been falling on deaf ears. And I think for me, that is a really important bit of communication. And that's what's been sadly lacking during this whole 12 months of the pandemic. In terms of going forward, we work quite closely with the North Wales and Merseyside Business Council. They represent a body of professional businesses like the FSB, like the CBI, all the colleges across North Wales and universities, and all of them, are asking for some form of regional development agency in order that we can prosper and take some control from the private sector perspective, because at the moment it's totally dominant on by the public sector. We have, and I'll finish there, we have, on this note, we have some opportunities going forward, because as many of you will know, we have the Economic Ambition Board for North Wales, and there's 220 million commitment to that. So it's a good start, but the private sector need to have a voice. I'll finish on that note.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Andrew, I can see you're gagging to get involved. I mean, out of all our guests here, you're in a prime position to be pushing an agenda here in Wales. What do you have to say about this?
Well, cheers, Matt, and cheers to the Centre for Welsh Studies for inviting me along tonight. Really appreciate it. And
Pleasure.
taking the article that we posted this morning with you. And I think Jim wins the prize for the most impressive backdrop, I have to say. I don't think I've seen, in 12 months of Zoom sessions, I don't think I've seen such an impressive backdrop as Jim's got there. But when I go around Wales, obviously not now with the restrictions, but in the 12, 13 years that I've been Assembly member stroke MS, I do see an ambitious country. But ultimately, I see an ambitious country that's been led very poorly. And someone might say, well, you'd expect a Conservative in the Assembly to say that after 21 years of Labour. But it has been led very poorly because we have some huge assets that just need unlocking and opportunities that need opening up for people. And to understand how we're going to unlock those opportunities, we need to understand the issues. And Wales suffers from 4 key points: isolation, lack of innovation, poor productivity, and lack of earnings. Isolation, I mean by geography. We are on the western fringes of the landmass of the continent of Europe, a bit like the Republic of Ireland, and you can't change that. So you have to ultimately decide what you can do to unlock that potential. And that's why we're very keen to promote at this election now on May the 6th, aspirations around infrastructure, the M4 relief road, for example, A55 improvements, A40, A470, electric car charging points and improvements in the metro system, rather than just being on the drawing board, bring those plans forward so people can have a joined up transport system wherever they live in Wales. Because if you open up the country, you open up to opportunities. And nothing is more evidently stark for people to look at than the regional variation in GVA. Now, for many people, as my article talks about, GVA sounds a very boring stat, but when you put it in these sort of terms, Cardiff's GVA, for example, is 32,310 per head of the population. In Anglesey, the lowest of any part of the United Kingdom, it's £15,008. talk about levelling up agendas required, that figure in itself is stark, to say the least. At northernmost point of Wales, we've got a GVA of 15,000. At the southernmost point, we've got a GVA of 32,000. So what we've got to do is use the levers that are available to any incoming government. And very often those levers are in the form of taxation, so that we can get businesses up and running and creating quality jobs that drive wages across the length and breadth of Wales. That's why in the article today, I talk about transformation in business rates, for example, the commitment to no new taxes and no new powers, such as road pricing and tourism tax, which has been touched on earlier. These are sort of taxes that will dampen aspiration and dampen job opportunities and dampen innovation in all parts of Wales. And then we have the income tax levers. And I understand the predicament we find ourselves in at the moment, but as a low tax Conservative, I want to see Wales being turned into a dynamic economy that actually attracts investment and attracts entrepreneurs to actually take those risks, take those opportunities that are presented by the government of the day to build businesses in here that will drive wages up. In 1999, for example, the average Scottish workers' take-home pay and Welsh workers' take-home pay was £301. That's 1999. Today, the difference between a Scottish worker and a Welsh worker is £55. A Welsh worker takes home £537 a week. A Scottish worker takes home £592 a week. Can you imagine what we could do if we could increase the wages across the length and breadth of Wales? When Labour politicians talk about austerity, if you could put more money into people's pockets so that they have the power to spend that money in their own communities, they make the decisions wherever they live in Wales. That is a damning indictment of Labour's failure here in Wales just in itself by not rewarding workers for the work that they put in on a day-to-day basis around Wales. And then we need the education and reskilling revolution that teaches vocational courses and academic courses on parity, because we need the plumbers, the carpenters and the builders as much as we need the academics, the scientists and all the academic professions to drive a 21st century economy. And it all too often, when we look back at Labour's history here, education, as the First Minister said himself, they've taken the eye off the ball. And when it comes to business support, the points that have been made earlier, the Welsh Labour government back in 2006 destroyed one of the strongest brands Wales had, the Welsh Development Agency, which at the time was valued at a brand of £100 million in the world market. Now, what we got to do is take what was good about the WDA, merge it with the Development Bank for Wales and Business Wales. So you've got a one-stop shop, arm's length of government that responds to the points that Jim was making, that is business-led rather than civil service-led. And if we can do that, I think we can get ourselves back into the branding market, whether it be in the tourism sector or the indigenous businesses or the inward bound businesses, by creating that mantra that the WDA, no project was too small, no project was too big, Wales was open for business, full stop. But what we've also got to do is make sure that the constitutional debate stops. Because time and time again, Labour politicians and nationalist politicians, for their shortcomings, shall we say, constantly refer to, we haven't got enough powers or we need independence. Home rule, for example, from the current First Minister is the current phrase that they like to use. Madam Price, it's an indie referendum within 5 years. And from the other side of the coin, abolishing the Welsh Parliament altogether. All three options are constitutional change that require referendums. Do we really think that an incoming government needs to be bogged down in constitutional change instead of focused on the economy and revolutionising all parts of Wales so that we can get those quality jobs that drive up take-home pay and drive business and development wherever you live in Wales? That's what we've got to be doing. So that again is our commitment around no new powers. And indeed, Wales is an innovative country that ultimately wants to succeed in the world. It just lacks the leadership here in Wales, the political leadership that has been in for 21 years. And that's the change that we have in little over 52 days' time. The chance to make that difference, make that change that can put Wales on the road to recovery from this awful pandemic we've all been through.
Thanks, Andrew. So business-led approach, taking Wales forward. Professor Kent Matthews, I know you've got some really interesting ideas about Wales. What do you think about this? Are we in need of radical change?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Yes, I think we need a radical change, and it's refreshing to hear Andrew Davies talking about a business-friendly, low-tax economy going forward. But Juan actually hit the nail on the head. We have a demographic problem in Wales, I mean, more so than the rest of the United Kingdom. And it's not just a question of keeping young people here, but attracting young people into Wales. Now, that requires us to think radically about all sorts of things, not just housing, but about taxation. And income tax is one of the most important things that actually drives mobility. And how do we have a low income tax economy in Wales? Well, that's very difficult because of the way things are set up in the budgetary system. If you go for a low tax, you immediately lose revenue. And of course, that's not made up from Westminster. So there's little incentive to do that. Why is that? It's because we're not allowed to borrow. I mean, we should be allowed to borrow like local authorities used to borrow in the 80s. Now, doing that actually is able to then spread the pain over so that you can actually get something like what we all know really exists, which is the Laffer curve, that through lower taxation, you generate growth, you generate mobility, you attract the right kind of people to come into the economy, you help businesses to start up, and then that generates the growth. The problem is, what do you do now? You know, you can't do it now because right now, if you were to lower taxes, you actually reduce your revenue, and so you're caught in this. So in some ways, I have sympathy with what Andrew Davies is saying about the constitutional issue, but there is a constitutional issue, and that if this government wants to have home rule, one of the things that's got to come with it is fiscal responsibility. With fiscal responsibility also comes the ability to smooth your taxation through borrowing. So I believe, yes, there is a need to radically think, and in some ways, you know, Mr. Davies lives in the world of deliverables. He lives in the world of the political cycle. He can't go forward to look beyond, say, 5 years. I mean, he does a great job in what he's doing now. But as academics, Juan and I, we can look in terms of a vision. How do we see Wales in the future? Now, I think I told you this story before, that during the Scottish referendum, I was phoned up by the BBC, and I was in Singapore, and they asked me what I thought about it, and I told them what I thought about it, and they said, what do you think if that we had something like that in Wales? And I said, well, you know, that's up to the Welsh people. But, you know, I'm phoning you from a country that's got a low tax, small government, high productive, a GDP or GVA per capita of about more than 1.5 times the size of that of Wales. Can we learn something from them? Yes, we can. You know, there's no reason why a country that's got no natural resources and only invested in their labor, their human capital, why we can't do something like that. We are got an abundance of natural resources. We heard from Jim Jones of these natural resources, how they're being used in North Wales. We need to think radically about how we can invest in our people as well as our infrastructure and the natural resources we have to get the best.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Kent Matthews. We've got our first question from the audience now, from Morgan Brobin. So how much do potential panelists see the creation of super business regions as a potential option here in Wales, especially on the England-Wales border? For example, Northeast Wales and Merseyside, Southeast Wales and Bristol. How could super business regions and zones work, you know, for the union and for business, and to attract young people into Wales? Andrew, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, cheers, Morgan, for the question. I mean, those links east-west, west-east, depending which way you want to look at them, have always been strong. And if anything, there's better links east-west than there is north-south when you come to the economy of Wales. Because in North Wales, for example, you look at the Mersey region concept, economic hub. And then in the south, you've also got, obviously, the strong links between the southwest and the South Wales economy. And then in mid Wales, very often, not just for services, but economic activity, there's strong links into the Midlands. And so as a government that doesn't want to create a slate curtain, if the Welsh Conservatives were in a position to inform this debate and be effective in government, we wouldn't be looking to create that slate curtain along Offa's Dyke. It's all about breaking down barriers for the economy. Coming out of Europe, we don't need to create false barriers anymore within the Union of the United Kingdom. And I think that's where it's an exciting opportunity with the Shared Prosperity Fund, with the levelling up agenda that the Westminster government got. Instead of trying to be on a constitutional battle all the time, look at the opportunities that are available to lever in support, lever in help, and the City Deal projects and the regional projects that have been championed out of the Westminster Treasury, along with the current Welsh Government, in fairness to them, and local authorities, have been drivers of these links. It's the nationalists then who want to create this slate curtain to break down those barriers, break down those links that have historically existed. And that's going to be detrimental to the economic impact that all parts of Wales could enjoy if we harness the infrastructure that we want to build with the Union highways and other infrastructure projects that link the Union together and make it more of a market concept that drives prosperity. Because if we don't open up our economy, that geographical isolation that I was talking about, which we can't change, we are where we are by nature geography, we have to make sure we take the island approach of linking up parts of the economy that they buy into and create that prosperity rather than creating barriers.
Jim, so opening up our economy, you do a lot of work with the Northwest and linking it in with North Wales. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Andrew. I think it's incredibly important that the links are strengthened across the Mersey-Dee Alliance area and the North Wales and Mersey-Dee. We rely heavily on the Northwest market. And I think it's fair to say probably 80% of our market in tourism, talking about specifically, comes from the Northwest of England. So, you know, those networks, east to west, west to east, are incredibly important to us, more so than north to south. And I think in North Wales, I mentioned it before, we kind of joined up. You know, we do have a really close-knit network. You know, the 6 local authorities work quite closely together under the Economic Ambition Board. We, from the private sector, work closely together with the North Wales Mersey-Dee Business Council, and we work very, very closely with the Mersey-Dee Alliance. Both of them are putting in stimulus packages. I know I mentioned the growth deal got 220 million to invest in major projects that hopefully is going to increase the jobs and the economy going forward. And the Mersey-Dee Alliance have also got a stimulus package that they're putting forward. But we are talking and we are working closely together. But for us, from a tourism perspective, the east to west crossover into the northwest of England is incredibly important to our 3.6 billion economy. That's what tourism's worth to North Wales, and most of it comes from over the border.
Okay, super business zones, Kemp, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a good idea, but I don't think that we have to put them in the context of the union. These things should happen irrespective of whether they're in a union or not in a union. This is simply something that occurs as a market outcome when two countries will trade, or even as two regions within one country will trade. One of the problems I have with this argument of being in union and thinking about the big picture is that we have to go in step with the United Kingdom. That's not a bad thing if the United Kingdom itself was very progressive and also thinking in terms of a low tax economy. You would think that a Conservative government would think like that. But in fact, what we hear from the current Conservative government is the potential for tax rises to pay for this pandemic. At the same time, the rhetoric has always been this pandemic, the borrowing for this pandemic is existential. It's like a wartime situation. There was no talk during the war that we have to raise taxes to pay for war debt. In fact, most of that war debt was paid off only, I think, a decade ago at the end of it. And that actually, what reduced that war debt was not taxation, but the inflation tax. Now, the inflation tax didn't come because of war debt. It came about because of excessive borrowing by governments in the 70s. And that led, and of course, a lack of monetary control. These two things led to the inflation, which had the effect of reducing the real value of war debt. Nobody thinks in terms of paying for something like this through taxation. You pay for this through growth. So now, if we have to stay in a union, we have to go in step with them. Whereas if we were to think radically, and let's take home rule, you know, whatever that means, if it means that we can have fiscal competition, well, that's different. Because what that means is that the border countries, the border counties and regions of the United Kingdom will have to compete with Wales. Wales will have a step forward. They can lead the United Kingdom. We have more influence in what's going on in Wales than what's going to happen in the rest of the United Kingdom. In much the same argument that United Kingdom made about Brussels, that we have more influence in Westminster than we have at Brussels. Well, we have more influence in what's going on in Cardiff. So let's think about radically how we can have a tax policy that competes and enables a business environment to grow and to have immigration, the right kind of immigration into Wales that would create the kind of human capital we need for a long-term growth.
A competitive tax system, Juan, how would that meet with super business owners? What do you think?
Well, I think that's really interesting, the competitive thing. But in spite of that, I do, maybe I'm naive. Maybe Professor Ken thinks that I'm being very naive when it comes to that. But as Andrew, I think it is actually, I feel that everything's so divided within the UK, not only in the world, but in the UK, that it would be nice for the nations to actually collaborate with each other, to stop competing against each other, and in this like constant power battle, in the need to show which one is better than the other, because it's leading to nothing, is leading to more division, and to actually more nativism that I think Jim Jones has pointed out is one of the main problems when it comes to attracting tourism to different parts of Wales, instead of having a rhetoric that is more openness and inviting people to come to Wales. So I think that's a constant problem. And if we want to bring more business-minded rhetoric, I think we need to have more of that openness. Also, I keep thinking about the opportunities for remote working now that the pandemic has brought that on, and what that could mean for Wales. So I see that as an opportunity, especially for coastal towns. We talk about the beauty of Wales, the beauty in the beautiful, and how diverse Wales is, and the natural beauty. Well, what are we doing to attract people to not only invest but to live in Wales? I think that those are exciting opportunities for Wales that we're not fully exploiting. And when it comes to what Andrew said about devolution and how focused the Welsh government is on that, I also keep wondering if actually, in talking so much about devolution and the powers that they don't have, instead of actually, although they constantly use rhetoric around redistribution and social justice and things like that, at the end of the day, I'm wondering if they're more concerned. I keep thinking that it's less about the people and more about giving more powers to a local elite. And that's how it seems to me. And I think it's not doing anything good for Wales.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Very interesting points made by both Kent and Juan over the last sort of 15 minutes around young people and the brain drain we have here in Wales and how it's affecting our economy. Some Welsh government statistics that came out in the last few days showed that young people are twice as likely to have been negatively affected within industries that have been closed down due to COVID. So where do you think that can go, Andrew? We need to attract young people. We need to make them want to come here and not leave in the first place. But the industries a lot of them work in Wales currently aren't very secure, and that's been shown in this pandemic. What can be done? Can Wales become a tech hub of Western Europe like Estonia is in Eastern Europe? What sort of vision can we create? I mean, I know you'll be announcing your manifesto over the next few weeks. Is there anything you can give away early that you're going to push for to attract young people to Wales?
Well, it is about making sure that the economy we're creating here in Wales retains Wales' own population to stay in Wales, the brightest and most able, because obviously so many people with the drain brain do leave Wales and look for other opportunities outside of Wales. It also attracts inward investment that creates those opportunities. And investment isn't just capital, it's intellectual capital as well then, and by people coming and choosing to locate here in Wales. Because we know we have the country that lures people in, and once they've come into Wales, they love it. But equally, you can't do that on an economy that's built on a low wage turnover. As I've said in my opening remarks, against Scotland, we've got a 55 quid gap between what the Welsh average take-home pay is and what the Scottish take-home pay is. Against the English take-home pay, it's £52 a week it is then. And that's why I touched on the income tax powers in particular, which Professor Kent was talking about, obviously using the tax system. There is the opportunity to create it via the tax system, the ability to be an attractive country that retains that intellectual ability to build the companies of the future that do offer young people the real opportunity to stay here in Wales. But unless you go into the public sector in Wales, at the moment, there is little or no incentive to stay in Wales and create your own opportunities. Survey after survey shows that entrepreneurs in Wales get to a certain threshold and then don't go above that because there isn't the thought that the economy can sustain a company bigger than a handful of number of employees in that business. So what we've got to do is remodel the education system with careers advice to make sure that that careers advice is good and put in the intellectual wealth of the country to work. Create the business base that creates the opportunities to pay wages that are competitive and more attractive than other parts of Britain and indeed the globe, so that we don't lose people from our universities and our vocational institutions as well then, because as I've said, it's about making sure that we got the vocational opportunities as well. I remember being in Dublin a couple of years ago and someone says everyone wants to go into IT in Dublin, but you try and find a plumber to fix a leaking pipe or solve an electrical problem that we face here in Dublin, and they'll be on 2, 3, 4 times the amount of an IT expert. So it's making sure that we've got a truly mixed and dynamic economy that's using those taxation levers that Professor Kent talked of to make sure that we incentivize people. And as an instinctive low tax conservative, I want to see a Welsh government using them fully and to the full advantage of Wales. And I do believe that we can open up that advantage via the tax system, which successive governments since those powers have come over to Wales have turned their back on.
Okay, Juan, young people, bring them into Wales, keeping the Welsh here. You know, what do you think? You're a young person. I mean, I live in Cardiff. Lots of young people here from all over the world. You go to Mid and North Wales, that's not really the case. They tend to be centralised around cities. Is that a problem?
Yeah, but you know, I kept hearing what Andrew was saying, and I was also thinking that I just think that in general in the UK, but more so when you're in Wales, there's such an anti-business rhetoric everywhere you go. Like if you pursue that, then you're kind of like a bad person if you think about big business and things like that. And it is true that 99% of businesses in Wales are micro and small businesses, and they should be supported, and they're the heart of Wales. But I also don't see why that then goes against also making Wales a welcoming place for big business. After all, I think they provide huge opportunities, not only for Wales, but for a lot of potential benefits for every individual in this country. And they're also very attractive to young people. And also, I kept thinking about the links that are missing between what the courses that are offered in universities and the local opportunities available in Wales. Because I know a lot of people who finish their course at universities in Cardiff and in Swansea, for example, and then they go out to find opportunities here and they simply don't exist. So they end up working, as I said at the beginning of what I had to say of this webinar, they go out and their only opportunities are, I don't know, working for DVLA. And it's far from probably what they want to do, but there's nothing else. And especially now during the pandemic, there's little to no opportunity for them to pursue other things. They have to live locally with their parents because they can't afford anything. And there's no incentive, but really no opportunity, no infrastructure for their dreams to become real at all. And I also kept wondering if, you know, just as much as we push courses on, it may sound ridiculous, but as much as we push courses on the English language and the Welsh language and maths and things like that, why not also focus on business from a very early age and teach just like basic skills to kids, and to also get them in that direction and get them into a business mind, for them to become more business minded, so that they can actually understand how that works, and that there's nothing wrong about creating your own business and creating your own wealth and the opportunities that offers once you're older.
Great. Jim, what's the situation up in North Wales?
Yeah, it's one of our biggest challenges, but you know, working in the tourism sector is quite a cool industry to be involved in. And we've got plenty of examples of, you know, I mentioned earlier about the new developments. I'll give you one classic example with the development of Zip World. You know, we know because we've done the economic impact assessment for that. And, you know, they created just in places like Bethesda and Blaenau Ffestiniog, nearly 220 jobs, local jobs, predominantly young people who 70% of them Welsh speaking, who have stayed in those areas and managed to get mortgages on the back of their higher than average minimum wage. So, you know, there are some really good examples and Adventure Park Snowdonia. But for us, I think the challenge is just to show the spread of opportunities that exist within the tourism hospitality sector across North Wales, because it is absolutely endless. And I know once we start to open up again, we're going to have a huge demand for those skills. And, you know, we've got to make sure that industry is attractive, because Juan's right. You know, he talks about anti-business rhetoric. You know, we've been faced with anti-tourism rhetoric, over tourism, you know, tourists coming in from over the border and infecting the communities. And I think one thing is clear, is those communities are the tourism is part of those communities, and those communities would struggle if they didn't have tourism industries within them. So we've got to really promote the opportunities that exist, because they are endless. And I said, it is a cool industry to work in, and we've just got to project that to the young people.
Absolutely. I mean, I've got a stag do in a few months' time, and I'm going up to your zip world, is it? I mean, I've been pulled into that, but I don't know if I'm looking forward to it or not. So I'll give you a bit of feedback soon enough on what I think. Kent, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think Juan actually made a very good point about the rhetoric of anti-business. And even in a subtle form, one sees this. I was looking at the local government finance reform statement, the document that came out of the Welsh government. And in it, you know, you read about statements such as ability to pay and progressivity. These two things come in quite a lot in that document. And of course, what's underlying that is that ability to pay and progressivity of the tax system is part of that rhetoric, that somehow if you are richer, you need to proportionately pay more. Well, of course, I mean, this whole business about progressivity is about the balance between equity and efficiency. And all the research we know says that the more progressive you are, the greater the disincentives there are to work, the greater the disincentives to taking risk, and the greater the incentive to avoid. Now, if we want to think radically, to go back to the very original thing that you asked, we need to think in terms of a different kind of tax system. And I raised this at a previous meeting, a flat tax. A flat tax is one where of course, all taxes create distortions, but a flat tax is one that there's no disincentive to avoid, because where do you avoid to? It's the same rate, whatever you do. And there's quite a lot of research that's coming out now slowly that's showing that this actually can generate more revenue. So how do we get to this? As I said, it's back again to thinking radically. You get to this as a medium-term objective. It's not going to happen overnight. You're not suddenly going to make people stay in Wales or come into Wales. But there are things that are happening that you can look at for the long term. In some ways, the pandemic has been one positive thing, is that we know that patterns of work are going to change. And that, you know, if we think in terms of a local income tax as place of residence, Wales is a very good place to work from. You know, you don't have to be in London. You don't have to be in the big cities. You can be in other parts of Wales. You could be in the idyllic parts of North Wales and still work from there, provided we have proper broadband. So I don't see why we shouldn't think radically in these kind of terms.
Absolutely. I mean, I know we at the Centre for Welsh Studies did a report last summer on how, you know, rural working can radically change the way in which the Welsh rural economy operates, you know, attracting those high-end business people from London, from Manchester, from Birmingham, from Bristol to move with their families to rural Wales. They can work from home, they're on big money, they can spend locally. Huge opportunities here that, frankly, the Welsh government aren't even looking at to try and attract people. You know, and these are policies that really could revolutionize the way we work, and actually flow into the next question from Helen Joy. Do you feel that food production and agriculture have a role in driving the Welsh economy, or are they becoming models for land use to support tourism and environmental drivers instead? And this is an area you're very keen to talk about, Andrew. What do you think?
Well, as a farmer myself, I have to declare an interest, obviously, but Wales has a great record and a great reputation for producing world-beating produce. Sadly, we've had government after government over the first 20 years of devolution that haven't built the processing sector to add value to that food. And so a lot of the value that is added to the produce that Wales produces is produced in other parts of the United Kingdom. So when we're talking about the economy and the ability to retain wealth within Wales, there's one leakage that we could plug pretty much straight away, is by promoting processing capacity here in Wales to add that value, that the product, when it reaches the market, is retaining as much value as possible in Wales. But I do think there's a great opportunity for Welsh farms and Welsh rural businesses here. I think it's a mix of diversifying as well to bring other income in. I mean, I'm someone who's got my 2 sons on the family farm, but if we were relying just on agriculture, obviously there wouldn't be that opportunity for 2 of them to seek out a future on that farm. So I'm realistic about how much wealth can be generated from producing food on its own. And it is important to make sure that we have a planning system that does reflect the needs of rural Wales and the opportunities that we can open up for rural Wales in particular when you're looking at diversification projects. But I personally think the future is limitless for Welsh agriculture if it gets the right regulatory environment. And as we've just seen recently with NVZs, for example, where the Welsh government has done a cut and paste job on pollution control measures from a European regulation of some 40 years standing, that its own regulator, NRW, has said will have perverse outcomes. That potentially could shut down a load of farm businesses, not because they're polluters, because one pollution incident is one too many, and we all want to see that job cleaned up as fast and as quickly as possible. But we want to make sure the right regulations are in place. And there was a voluntary code put on the table, agreed with the regulator, that the industry could have had confidence going forward, that they could make the investments to create the food sector that we all want to see Wales thrive in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years going forward. So I do think the future is very bright for Welsh food production if we can get the right regulatory environment. Again, it does fall back to what sort of government is formed after May the 6th. And I think that's why it's so important for rural Wales and farming in particular, that the government that understands rural Wales is in place after May the 6th. But we know the opportunities exist. It goes back to this whole presentation tonight about having the right leadership to unlock those opportunities. And we haven't had that in the first 20 years. Let's make the change and make the change for the better on May the 6th and turn it over for a new leaf come May the 7th.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really insightful to hear about the rural economy like that. Juan, diversifying our rural economy. Obviously, you're not an agricultural expert. So in terms of what we were discussing earlier about young people and people from cities moving to places like Mid Wales, selling up their big pads in the city and moving on down, could that be a great thing if they can work from home from Mid Wales and North Wales?
It could, but also I was thinking about what Jim Jones said about the problems that he faces in his industry from locals that don't want to see tourists and things like that, and that maybe they also think that they're present, that the presence of tourists and tourism in general goes against other local economies. And I think we need to also fight that rhetoric that the success of tourism represents the death of agriculture, or the success of agriculture, it goes against tourism. It shouldn't be like that. But I think one of the ways to reverse that is to also think about the possibilities after Brexit, and for the UK government and the Welsh government. They have both the responsibility to actually be clearer about how Wales, the UK and Wales, can flourish after that. There's been a lot of talk of an internal market, but we still have to understand and define what that actually means. And I think the Senate raised that concern, rightfully so. I think we also need to think about the future of green economies. There's been a lot of talk of making the Welsh economy greener, but what are the opportunities for that? What are the costs for that? And I think green economies are something that younger people are very keen on, but we also need to understand for them and with them what that means for their future, because at the end of the day, greener economies are a thing that I think is something that is happening, but the bigger policies in that relation are yet to come. And it would be interesting if younger people also became an active part of that discussion, how they can benefit from that. How can they learn from what other countries are doing in terms of those green economies? But it's really important to understand the costs for tourism, understand the cost for agriculture, because it does come at a high cost. And I think there's a lot of confusion in that regard, but it's an interesting path that I think needs to be investigated.
Okay, so Jim, North Wales, what's the possibilities about people moving in? I know you said that there's sometimes a vocal group there that maybe are opposed to such a thing and opposed to tourism. Are they a vocal minority? Is this something that we welcome in North Wales?
They're definitely a vocal minority, but coming to the countryside and agriculture and farming, we see it as immersive tourism. And we've got many, many examples of farmers who have now diversified into having a really good tourism offer and doing extremely well out of it. And I think that's an emerging market where people want to come and really experience, what Wales is all about. And one of the key areas that we really push in terms of promotion is our food and drink offer, because, our food and drink offer is unique. And I don't think many people on this panel or the audience will probably realize that in Japan at this moment in time, the powerhouse of Japanese tourism called JATA, Japanese Associations of Travel Agents, have a campaign called the 100 Top Food and Drinks, across Europe. And within that list of 100, Wales has 5, that they are promoting to their Japanese potential visitors, outbound visitors. And just to let you know what those 5 are, because probably most people will be intrigued, but it's blue lobster, it's Welsh lamb, of course, batter brief and Welsh cake, lava bread and cowl. And they are 5 products that for one reason or the other, because of the quality of them as well, but the Japanese are promoting that on our behalf. So I think we've got a lot to shout from the rooftops about with regards to quality of our food and drink. That's second to none. But in terms of diversification within our rural and agricultural areas, huge potential from a tourism perspective, especially in a place like North Wales, which we have the urban conurbations and huge rural areas as well, with lots of land in order to do activity and learn and understand.
Absolutely. So Kent, the possibilities are endless for our rural economy. What are your thoughts on what can be done here, to transform our rural economy?
Well, I think that the points have already been made, and I'm looking again much longer term. Juan has made the point about changing culture and education, and that's very important because we can use that to nudge our culture towards a business orientation. We then also need to look at our planning system, because what adds value in the rural economy is land with planning permission. And if we have to start talking about taxes, I'm sorry to come back to this, if we're going to start reducing taxes on income and on businesses and corporation tax, we still need to pay for our services. We need to find other forms of tax, and we want to have the least distortionary tax. And one less distortionary tax is land value tax. And of course, then we come into what do we mean by value of land? And of course, value of land comes with planning permission. And so that's where the diversification comes in for the rural economy. So yeah, I mean, yes, I'm all for it, but we need to look again at not just bits and pieces, but the big picture.
Okay, thanks. So we'll go on to our last sort of element here of the webinar, and then we will call it a day. I saw that Paul Wynn in the chat mentioned, where's the drive for Welsh government to actually change things in Wales? When they're so complacent, when they think they can win every election, when there's no threat of them leaving office, why would they want to change things? So, Andrew, I'll go on to everyone here, but Andrew, what's your message to people, who think, I want things to change in Wales, we can have a brighter future, but we can't get Welsh Labour out of office?
Well, I think it's a simple message. You need to vote, which most people say, well, that was what a politician would say at any election. But the reality is, if you take a general election, 70 to 75% of the electorate voted a general election in Wales. If you take an assembly election, stroke Welsh parliamentary election, 45%. So 25 to 30% of the electorate just tail off between the elections. And predominantly that tail off is amongst centre-right voters. But if you ask most people in Wales what their top 5 priorities might be, for example, I'm pretty sure the economy would come pretty high up there. I'm pretty sure education would come pretty high up there. I'm pretty sure health would, the environment, transport. I could go on, but really the priority areas that you need to consider if you're conscious of where your vote counts are now in the gift of Cardiff Bay and whoever forms the executive out of Cardiff Bay and Invertays Park. And so that's why it's really important to galvanise the centre-right vote in Wales to come out on May the 6th and vote. And if you believe in a low-tax economy that rewards innovation and actually turns the page on the decline that we've seen over the first 21 years of Labour rule in Cardiff Bay, then this is the election to make this happen. Because one thing that COVID has done is make people aware where responsibility actually exists for many of the areas people do have concerns about. And if we do want to increase wages here in Wales, if we do want to get a better education system, and we do want to make sure that no part of Wales is left behind in those stats that I gave you between the GVA of Cardiff and the GVA of Anglesey and everything in between, we need to make sure that we have a change of administration in Cardiff Bay. Now, I can go around as much as I want, as enthusiastically as I want, but if people turn their back on the ballot box because they don't believe that they can change Labour, then Labour will continue for another 5 years. If people don't want no new taxes and no new powers in Cardiff Bay, then they really do need to vote in the Welsh Conservative box, I would suggest, but I'm sure others will come on this webinar in future events and make their own case. But I passionately believe that as a party that is in government in Westminster and potentially could be in government in Cardiff Bay, we can make that difference, make that change, and get that centre-right vote to coalesce around the Welsh Conservative message. So let's make sure we try and do that for May the 6th, make that change. Otherwise, what's promised is a nationalist socialist carve-up that will give more constitutional uncertainty, more detrimental harm to the economy, and more detrimental impact on life chances here in Wales for everyone.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'll tell you this slightly differently to our other panelists, as they're not politicians. What can we do as individuals to, push a pro-business message, campaign for change here in Wales? Is it pressure groups? Is it business groups such as the ones Jim are involved with? Is it Kent coming on these sorts of shows with Juan and trying to get the message out to the public? Kent, what do you think can be done?
I think Juan hit the nail on the head when it comes to education. We need to start changing culture, and that takes, we have to take a long view. That takes a long time. I mean, the thing is, we have to get away from the idea that somehow we have to live on the handouts from Westminster. In the same way that before that we used to think in terms of living in the handouts of Brussels. It actually is our own money. We can generate our own wealth. We can generate our own income, and that requires a certain amount of pride and independent thinking. That Wales can do it, and I do believe that they can do it. They have the raw materials. We've got great natural resources. We have the potential, if we can keep our young people in Wales and attract others, to actually grow this economy and be. I know it sounds crazy to think of in these terms, but to be the Singapore of Europe.
The Singapore of Europe. We can only dream. Juan, what's your pitch?
Well, I think one of the things that is really hard to change here in Wales, but I think it's also very difficult to change anywhere else, is sort of like the cultural rhetorics that underpin a particular society. And I think something that Labour has been very successful at for years is to, and I think that this applies to Scotland as well, is everything that happens in London is bad. Everything the Conservatives do is bad. So in that sense, they have done a tremendous job at convincing people at a local level that whatever they do will be better, even though they really have nothing to show in the sense that they have actually done that. But it's really interesting how culturally they've managed to take advantage of that in order to stay in power, even if they have no results to show. I'm not sure how you can reverse that, because I think that's also a national problem. I think in terms not only in Wales, but also in terms of the UK. Even though the Conservatives have been in power in the UK for far longer than Labour, at a local level, there seems to be so much of a despise for anything that Conservatives do, even if Conservatives have actually provided more of the means for them to have any wealth at all. And I think it's in the hands of actually also showing younger people, as I keep going back to them, of the possibilities that a conservative or non-labor party can do for them. I don't want to just keep it in terms of like, because the reality in other parts of the UK are different. So in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. So I think we need to be creative in terms, we need the creativity that actually Cardiff Bay lacks and doesn't seem to be interested in. Someone in the comments keeps going on about housing, and I keep pushing for that as well. We need, for instance, to show people, younger people, that although house prices keep going off the roof in Wales, they still maintain that cap of 250,000 of help to buy. Which property can actually, so which property is below that? Actually, not very good properties. And I think future generations, as previous ones, also deserve the right to create their own families in dignity and to be provided with the adequate support to do that. And I think this government is failing them in that regard. And we have to keep pushing those elements where the current government is failing them, like that one, housing.
Absolutely. I know you've got a report coming out for us very soon, Juan, on the housing market in Wales, and we'll be sending it to many politicians, Andrew, yourself included, to see what you think on that. So, Jim, just to round up now and finish off, what are your thoughts?
I think for us, and especially from a tourism perspective, to all parties, is the recognition of the tourism industry and the importance it plays in terms of the pillars of our own economy and our communities. It's also extremely key to the recovery of our economy also. But the biggest message that I have, which is what we've experienced, especially over the 12 months, is listening. And from a business perspective, is that the Welsh Government need to listen to what we're saying, because they're not.
Fantastic. Okie doke. Thank you everyone for attending tonight's event. We have another one next Wednesday, which we'll be advertising later on this week. And then next month, we're launching our pre-Senedd election specials with a number of speakers and public affairs professionals and commentators from across the UK to discuss what's going to happen in Wales in May at the elections. Thank you all very much.